Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming here tonight. When I started thinking of the Civil War Book Club a couple months ago, I guess around the end of last year, one of the major impetuses for wanting to get this program off the ground and calling Kelly and saying, hey, I want to do a book of the month subscription program, sending people Civil War history books every month, is that the New York Times launched a blog called Disunion, which was looking at the sesquicentennial events. I think they basically started with Lincoln's election in November 1860, and one of the first posts that I saw on the Disunion blog at the Times was by Adam Goodheart, and it said at the bottom that he is the author of the forthcoming 1861, The Civil War Awakening from Knopf. And I was like, well, I guess that's a good place to start. And so here we are tonight. For those of you who have been following Disunion, you've seen many of Adam's posts. Only little bits and pieces of which, from what I can tell, have are drawn from the book. There's a lot of stuff that is not in the book, in the blog, but they're both uniformly excellent and dynamic. I mean, as you were saying earlier, it's about storytelling, and he tells a wonderful story about a very incredible period in our nation's history. Adam is a historian and a journalist, and his day job is as the director of the Center for the Study of American Experience of the American Experience at Washington College in Maryland. And we were talking about it before, and it's basically it's a multidisciplinary approach to American history, and two, a way to sort of promote the treatment of history as literature, as storytelling, to make it come alive for contemporary audiences and for us to remember just how much we owe to our past, which is something that we will be talking about shortly. But before we get into the conversation, I would like to invite Adam to read a brief segment from 1861 covering an event which took place 150 years ago this week, just a little bit south of here, the firing upon at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Goodheart.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Ron, and especially Ron. Your Civil War Book Club is such a great idea. I just said to him before, it's amazing that nobody has thought of it already. You just say, it makes so much sense. And thanks to you guys for coming. I'm actually really happy that we have this sort of small, intimate group, because the past 2 nights I spoke to like 300 people, and so here I just feel like we've got that sort of fire circle thing going on, or for me, and I think for a lot of people, so much of my love of books comes from sitting in a classroom listening to my teacher reading aloud. And actually, when I was right out of college, my friends and I started a book club that was not a book club to sort of sit and opine about books, but we just simply would read passages aloud to each other over red wine or chocolate cake or whatever. So I feel like this is a sort of a reconvening maybe of the book club. Yeah. Well, red wine is what I just fought my way through traffic down I-95, so I didn't know what's the wine. So yeah, so I'm going to read to you. I'm a strong believer in history as story. I mean, the words are in Romance languages the same word. History is story, which we lose touch with sometimes, especially maybe some of my colleagues in academia occasionally lose touch with that. But I really think that the first job of the historian is to tell stories about the past. So I'll give you a little bit of story. As Ron said, I'm going to talk about the surrender of Fort Sumter. The formal surrender occurred exactly 150 years ago today, but the informal surrender is what I'm going to talk about tonight. And it was, when I was researching the book, it was one of the episodes that really sort of surprised me the most. This story of how it sort of is weird, it's absurd, it's comic, it's not the way that you expect this sort of great national drama and tragedy of the Civil War to have begun. It's almost sort of comic opera. So I'm going to read some of that to you. Have to start with introducing a couple of characters to you. There is to set the scene, there's this, of course, little Fort Sumter on a 2-acre island in the middle of Charleston Harbor. Militarily, basically, pretty much unimportant. But it's become sort of the grain of sand in the oyster of the Confederate States of America, you might think of it. It's this irritant that just has to be expunged. And so this tiny little force, it's just 60 soldiers, a handful of officers, and a brass band are hanging out there and becoming the epicenter of an unfolding national crisis. The Confederacy, I'll gloss over the story here, but the Confederacy, of course, opens fire on April 12th, deciding to drive these men out. One of my characters in the book, whom I talk about a lot, is Major Robert Anderson, who will appear in here. He's the commander. He's a very sort of conflicted, internally divided, ambivalent, and ambiguous figure, which is a reason I like him. Another one is Captain Abner Doubleday, who is the Doubleday of Cooperstown fame. I can talk about that afterwards if you want. And Doubleday is one of Anderson's staff officers and is sort of the strongest, staunchest abolitionist and fiery anti-secessionist in the group. And then another one who will make an appearance is a man named Private John Thompson. And he's the only ordinary soldier from Fort Sumter of whom we have any firsthand account of the battle. And he was in some ways typical of the men there. He's an Irish immigrant. And of these 73 enlisted men and brass band in Sumter, only 13 of them were born in the United States. Most of them are from Ireland, they're from Germany. It was a very different sort of military than we might think of at that point. So he's a young Irish immigrant. The person I have to introduce first to you, who will make an appearance in the story pretty soon, is a man named Louis T. Wigfall. Great. You really did names right in the 19th century. Have any of you heard of Louis T. Wigfall before? Oh, good. Well, it's such a privilege to introduce a new character. He was a member of the U.S. Senate until he decided not to be. Perhaps the feistiest Southerner of all was Louis T. Wigfall, a freshman senator from Texas. This new man from a new state might represent the future, though there were many who devoutly hoped not. His very face was that of a man who, whatever his other gifts might be, found it unbearable to hear more than 3 or 4 words spoken consecutively by anyone else. His beetling eyebrows clenched and unclenched when he talked, which was almost incessantly, and his pugnacious black beard seemed to jut out perpendicular to his face. Even his nose, an English journalist wrote, was somehow argumentative. I'm still, a year after finding, I'm still trying to figure out what's an argumentative nose look like. Well, he had one. But his eyes, that same writer continued, were most dangerously transfixing, of wonderful depth and light, such as I never saw before, but in the head of a wild beast. If you look someday when the sun is not too bright, into the eye of a Bengal tiger in the Regent's Park in London, as the keeper is coming around, you will form some notion of the expression I mean. By the age of 25, Wigfall, a native South Carolinian, had managed to squander his considerable inheritance, settle 3 affairs of honor on the dueling ground, fight in a ruthless military campaign against the Seminole Indians, consume a small lake full of bourbon, win an enviable reputation in whorehouses throughout the South, and get hauled before a judge on charges of murder. 3 years after that, he took the next logical step and went into Texas politics. Of all the Southern fire eaters in the Senate, Wigfall was the most flamboyant and inflexible. He scorned the very idea of compromise, openly relished the prospect of spilling Yankee blood, and crowed that the war would end only after Southern troops had cut a swath of destruction across the North, with the final capitulation signed in Boston's Faneuil Hall. So that's this Wigfall, who will shortly appear in A Strange Place. Wigfall, not surprisingly, he sort of lingers on in the Senate actually after his state has officially left the Union. He's sort of like that guest at the dinner party you can't get rid of, everybody's kind of sick and tired of him, and he's just sort of lingering on, giving these long, drunken speeches, sort of inveighing against the North. But eventually, he sort of totters out of Washington, makes his way down to the epicenter of secession in Charleston, sort of attaches himself as a sort of a man about the Provisional Confederate Army. He doesn't really exactly have a military appointment of any kind, but it's sort of where the action is, and he just makes himself a busybody at large in the southern siege of Charleston. So now we're going to go ahead to the second and last day of the attack on Fort Sumter, which is April 13th, 1861. Enemy fire rained down on Sumter more briskly than ever, and, thanks to the better weather, more accurately. As the soldiers struggled to work their guns, several were badly cut up by flying pieces of masonry. A shell just outside one of the casemates, these little brick boxes they fired the cannons out of, sent metal fragments tearing into a man's legs. Soon the defenders could see the enemy firing red-hot cannonballs heated in furnaces ashore. The rebel gunners were now truly shooting to kill. A mortar round plowed through the roof of the half-ruined officers' quarters, and the large building soon became a roaring tower of flame. The iron water tanks inside burst, and a scalding cloud of steam and smoke, acrid from the slow burning of damp pine floorboards and rafters, poured into the casemates as the artillerymen fell, blinded and choking, to the ground, masking their faces with wet handkerchiefs. Most of the garrison would have suffocated to death, Captain Abner Doubleday said later, had not the wind mercifully shifted and begun blowing the smoke in the opposite direction. But the men soon confronted an even more terrifying threat as the blaze that had begun in the officers' quarters began closing in on the cannoneers' gunpowder stores. The men heaved barrel after barrel out of the embrasures. Across the harbor, meanwhile, the sun still shone. Thousands of Charlestonians, male and female, black and white, young and old, one observer wrote, were watching the battle from the wharves, the rooftops, and the church steeples. By midday, disappointingly little of the fort was visible. It was as if a volcano had risen from the sea at the center of the harbor, vomiting smoke. All that the spectators could make out through the thick clouds was Sumter's flag on its tall staff. The smoke hid even that flag for a while. When it drifted away once more, the enemy banner, the familiar stars and stripes, had disappeared. Cheers rang from the rooftops. All around the harbor, the rebel gunners held their fire. Fort Sumter, they congratulated themselves, had finally struck its colors. But it had not. Suddenly, these men are inside the casemate, manning the guns, and they see something surprising. Just as Private Thompson and the rest of his gun crew were loading their cannon to continue the battle, they heard a commotion from the adjacent casemate. Cannoneers were seizing muskets and pointing at something or someone on the beach just outside the fort. And then, astonishing and absurd, a man's face appeared, right in the embrasure through which Private Thompson was about to fire his cannon. It was the face of a middle-aged gentleman, a bit thick in the jowls, with a black beard that seemed to bristle angrily in all directions, and black eyes that flashed with righteous indignation. He was dressed not in a military uniform, but in a frock coat and top hat. Gasping with exertion, cursing and swearing, he was now struggling unsuccessfully to pull himself up over the sill of the gun port with one arm, while his other hand awkwardly grasped a sword, a white handkerchief tied to its point. The soldiers, crowding around, held the stranger at bay with their muskets. Was this some sort of rebel trick? The advanced guard of an amphibious attack on the fort? No. The bizarre apparition was, although none of the men recognized him, the Honorable Mr. Lewis T. Wigfall, lately United States Senator from the now seceded state of Texas. Fort Sumter had not, in fact, surrendered. A stray shot from the rebels had toppled the flagstaff. Sergeant Peter Hart and two comrades, at great risk to life and limb, had ventured forth to raise the banner again on a makeshift pole, for which valiant feat they would soon be celebrated by journalists, lithographers, and political orators throughout the Union. But during that brief silencing of the Confederate batteries, Senator Wigfall, smelling glory in the air, had taken it upon himself to set forth from Fort Moultrie, a rebel-held fort, in a small rowboat with the goal of personally securing Anderson's formal capitulation. An unlucky Confederate private and 3 slaves, whom he had dragooned into service at the oars, accompanied him. By the time Moultrie's commanding Confederate officers noticed what Wigfall was up to and began yelling for him to stop, the boat was already out of earshot. They fired a warning shot across his bow, but still the senator, much to the consternation of his own oarsmen, would not turn back. By the time they reached the middle of the channel, the Confederate batteries around the harbor had begun opening fire once more, as had Major Anderson's cannons at Fort Sumter, and the colonel in charge at Fort Moultrie ordered his gunners to sink that damned politician. The damned politician in question, Wigfall, despite his extensive youthful experience with dueling pistols, found incoming artillery rounds a bit harder to face. Wigfall tied his handkerchief to his sword and stood up in the bow of the little boat, hoping the gunners would honor his makeshift flag of truce, but managing only to nearly swamp the boat. With shots splashing around them, he and his crew somehow made it safely to shore, with Sumter now under a full-on Confederate barrage. Showers of bricks fell from above as the portly senator clambered over rocks and debris toward the embrasures, sword and handkerchief in hand. No one in the fort had noticed his boat coming. "We stubbornly refused him admittance for a while," wrote Thompson, "but he begged so hard, exhibited the flag he carried, and even surrendered his sword," handing it to Private Thompson, "that at last we helped him in." Now, incidentally, there's a description of Wigfall himself several days later talking to a journalist from the Times of London, telling this journalist the story of the surrender of Sumter. And in his telling, Wigfall charged in through the embrasure, waving his sword, and the gun crew sort of fell back and began cowering in the corner, wondering who this bold warrior was. And the English journalist, the very canny journalist William Howard Russell, recounts this story and then says to his readers, "Well, it must be confessed that a strong aroma of bourbon hung in the air around the senator as he told this story." So, anyway, so he jumps into the embrasure, and now to the artillerymen's astonishment, the bearded gentleman ordered them to stop firing, a command that they naturally ignored. At last someone called for Major Anderson, the Union commander, who tried to mask his own surprise as he stepped into the casemate and saw the stranger. "To what am I indebted for this visit?" he asked dryly. "I am Colonel Wigfall, of General Beauregard's staff," the ex-senator rasped in as official voice as he could muster. "For God's sake, Major, let this thing stop. There's been enough blood shed already." He had come, he said, to offer terms of surrender. Under the present circumstances, in fact, the shell-shocked envoy appeared ready to accept any terms whatsoever that would make the shooting go away. But Wigfall's little speech, plain enough as it was on its face, was a bit specious at best. For one thing, the bloodshed that so far consisted of a single Confederate horse. More important, although implying that he came on Beauregard's authority, Wigfall had not even seen the Confederate commander in several days, much less received any instructions from him. The men at Sumter could not have known this, of course. Major Anderson pointed out that there had been no bloodshed, at least on his own side, and besides, your batteries are still firing at me. "I'll soon stop that," Wigfall replied briskly. He turned to Private Thompson, who held the sword and handkerchief under one arm, pointed to the embrasure, and told the astonished private, "Wave that out there." "Wave it yourself," Thompson retorted in his thick brogue, handing the Confederate his sword back. Wigfall leapt boldly into the opening, somehow believing that the gunners half a mile away would glimpse his handkerchief through the thick smoke and recognize it as a flag of truce. Presently, a shot from Fort Moultrie slammed into the nearby wall, disabusing him swiftly of this notion. "If you desire that to be seen," Anderson said gently, "you had better send it to the parapet." Several minutes later, Charlestonians on their distant rooftops spotted something waving on a pole above Sumter's bomb-scarred ramparts alongside the Stars and Stripes. This was not Senator Wigfall's handkerchief, but a full-size white flag. It signaled a ceasefire while Major Anderson negotiated, or rather dictated, as Thompson later said, his terms of surrender.